Elias Vance didn't die from the freezing wind of the Nebraska sandhills. He died from a single frozen splinter that turned his blood into a slow-moving river of poison. It was a cruel, tiny irony for a man who had survived the horrors of the Civil War and the treacherous crossing of the Missouri River, only to have a 20 meters jagged shard of seasoned ash settle into his thumb during the first deceptive frost of 1,883. Within 3 days, the infection had climbed his arm like a dark vine. His fever burned hotter than the very hearth he was trying to finish, and, by the time the moon rose on the fourth night, Clara Vance was a widow. She was left alone on a 160-acre claim, with nothing but 2 young sons and a dead man's woodpile, a meager stack of green cottonwood and barely seasoned ash that Elias hadn't finished splitting before the earth claimed him. The cabin he had built was a testament to his effort, but a victim of a terrible design flaw that Clara was only beginning to understand as she sat in the heavy silence after the funeral. The walls were thick cottonwood logs, notched and stacked with a desperate, loving haste, but they acted as a thermal sieve rather than a fortress. In the brutal logic of the frontier, a log house is often just a collection of cracks held together by hope and a little bit of mud, and Clara, you could feel the convective scour every time the wind shifted across the open prairie. It wasn't just that the cold was coming in through the gaps, it was that the house seemed to be actively inviting the wind to pull the warmth right out of the marrow of her bones. She watched the candlelight flicker in the exact center of the room, even though the door was barred and the windows were sealed with thick oiled paper. The air was moving in organized circles, a ghost of a breeze that swept down the cold interior surface of the logs and pooled in a frigid layer around the floor, where her boys slept. If you find this exploration of frontier life meaningful, please hit the like button and subscribe to our rating channel for more stories of quiet resilience. Clara knew the unforgiving math of the plains, and it was a math that usually ended in zeros. She had only 3 cords of wood, and the first true winter storm hadn't even peaked yet. At her current rate of consumption, she would be completely out of fuel by Christmas, leaving her and her young boys to face the killing months of January and February with nothing but blankets and prayers. The house Elias had built to protect them was failing her, and Clara realized with a heavy heart that if she didn't find a way to alter the physical reality of these walls, the Nebraska winter would finish what the frozen splinter had started. She was not just fighting for her land. She was fighting against a thermal reality that didn't care about her grief or her determination. Clara was barely back from the gravesite, the mud still damp on her hem, when the first of the social vultures arrived in the form of Henrietta Thorne. Henrietta was the self-appointed moral compass of the settlement, a woman who wore her piety like a shield and her charity like a sharpened weapon. She didn't knock so much as announce her presence, sweeping into the cabin with a gust of freezing air and a look of practiced pity that didn't quite reach her cold eyes. Behind her was the smell of lavender and expensive cold wool, a sharp, jarring contrast to the smell of wood smoke and damp earth that defined Clara's daily life. Henrietta's charity was actually a business proposal, disguised as a Christian duty. She spent 10 minutes talking about the will of the Lord before mentioning that her brother, a land speculator from Dodge City, was looking for a pre-established claim just like this one. He was willing to offer Clara a few $100s a pittance for 160 acres of prime land, but Henrietta framed it as an act of selfless mercy. She argued that a woman alone couldn't possibly manage the ordered demands of a winter on the sandhills, especially with 2 young boys depending on her for their very lives. She made it clear that the county looked poorly on mothers who allowed their children to suffer in a freezing house, and if Clara could not keep this cabin above the point of frost, by the time the deep freeze hit, they may decide that a different Placement for her sons was necessary. It was an ultimatum wrapped in a velvet glove, a threat that struck at the core of Clara's being. To prove Henrietta's point, the bucket of water sitting on a bench just 3 feet from the hearth had already begun to form a thin, jagged skin of ice. Clara looked from the ice to the woman who was trying to steal her future and realized that the pressure was mounting from every side. The settlement expected widows to fail, to sell out, and to vanish back to the civilization of the East. Henrietta was just the most vocal of the doubters, representing a social group that valued the home over a desperate one. But Clara saw the hunger in Henrietta's eyes, a hunger for the land Elias had bled for, and she realized that she wasn't just fighting the weather. She was fighting an entire community that was waiting for her to break. She told Henrietta that the Vance claim would stay with the Vances, and suggested she tell her brother to look elsewhere for his easy bargains. Henrietta left with a stiff spine, her departure a silent promise that the settlement's observers would be watching. Clara was now on notice, and the mercury was dropping faster than her hopes. That night, a blue norther hit the sandhills with a sudden, violent intensity that shook the cabin to its very footings and made the walls groan in protest. The temperature didn't just drop, it plummeted, falling 30 degrees in a matter of hours until the very air felt brittle enough to snap. Clara sat by the hearth, her 2 boys huddled on a mattress nearby, while the wind probed the cabin walls like an intruder, looking for a way inside. She could hear the timber whistling, a high, thin sound that occurred when the pressure outside forced air through the microscopic gaps in the cottonwood logs and the drying mud chinking. It was the sound of her survival leaking away into the night. Every time a fresh gust hit the north wall, the flame of her single oil lamp would dance and almost die, even though she had stuffed rags into every visible crack she could find. The thermal sieve was working against her with a methodical cruelty. The heat from the fire rose straight to the peak of the ceiling and vanished through the frost roof boards, while the cold air from the walls dropped like a waterfall of ice to the floor. Clara realized that she was caught in a cycle of convective failure, feeding the fire as fast as she could split the wood, yet barely, keeping the center of the room at 50 degrees. Her woodpile was her hourglass, and the sand was running out with terrifying speed. She looked at her sons, their breath visible in the dim light, and felt a wave of terror that nearly choked her. If she continued to follow the traditional methods of the Clasting 01 settlement, she would run out of wood before the new year and be forced to crawl to Henrietta Thorne and beg for the very pittance that would dissolve her family. The emotional stakes had moved beyond grief into a territory of pure, raw survival. Clara refused to be another frontier failure, another story told. At the trading post about a widow who couldn't hold her own, she began to think about the nature of heat and the nature of the walls Elias had built. The logs were solid, but they were also a bridge for the cold, carrying that chill straight through to the inside. She needed a barrier that didn't just block the wind, but changed how the air behaved inside the room. She stayed awake until dawn, watching the frost crawl up the interior of the door like a living thing, her mind racing through every scrap of knowledge she had. If you want to see how she solves this, stay with us as we head into the next part of the story. She was a woman at the edge of the world, and she knew that the answer wasn't in more wood, but in a completely different way of thinking. The following morning, Clara hitched the remaining mule to the small sled and headed across the frozen creek toward the outskirts of the settlement to find Marta Sorensen. Marta was an elderly Swedish woman who lived in a tiny, unassuming hut that most people in the valley dismissed as a foreigner's hovel. She was an outsider in every sense she spoke, with an accent that was thick with the vowels of her homeland, and she didn't attend the local meetings or the church socials. People said her hut was too small to be healthy, but Clara had noticed that even when the wind was howling across the plains, Marta's home felt different. It didn't have the drafty, echoing chill of the larger cabins, and a thin, steady trail of smoke rose from her chimney, far less than the billowing clouds produced by the proper homes in town. When Clara stepped inside, the contrast was immediate and shocking. Marta's hut was more than just comfortable. It felt like a pocket of mid-June held fast against a November gale. There was no frost on the walls, and the air felt thick and heavy with a warmth that seemed to cling to the skin like a soft blanket. Marta was sitting in a rocking chair, knitting a wool sock with a methodical focus, her face lined with the deep wisdom of a woman who had lived through 70 Scandinavian winters. She told Clara that the logs were stealing her spirit because the Americans thought only of the wood. Marta's father had been a master shipwright in Stockholm, a man who spent his life building vessels that had to keep men alive in the North Sea, and he understood that a hull was more than just wood. It was a managed environment. He had taught her that if the air moves, the heat dies, but if the air stands still, the fire lives. Clara leaned in, realizing that she was finally hearing the truth she had been searching for. Marta explained that her father had used the same principles to build their winter homes, using the air itself as the primary defense against the subarctic cold. Marta set down her knitting and picked up a piece of charcoal from the hearth, drawing a rough circle on the floor to represent the cabin and showing Clara how the air inside was moving. "Your house has convective loops," she explained, describing how the warm air hits the cold log, gets heavy, and drops, creating an invisible wind that scours the heat off the skin and carries it into the cracks. The solution was to create a stagnant air column between the living space and the world outside. This was the core lesson of Scandinavian building. Air that is trapped and unable to move acts as a powerful insulator because it doesn't conduct heat. The goal wasn't to fight the log walls, but to render them irrelevant by trapping a layer of air against those cold timbers, a layer that was held so tightly it could not form a loop. Marta called it the double sash principle, similar to the windows on the grand houses in Uppsala. Two barriers with a calculated void between them. Do the work that a single thick material cannot. The gap had to be precise, not too narrow, or the heat would simply jump across it, and not too wide, or the air would begin to circulate and start to loops again. 5 centimeters was the magic number her father had used for the Dayton hulls of the Baltic trade ships. That gap created a dead zone where the air sat in an ordered, motionless state, effectively doubling the thermal resistance of the wall without adding a single extra log. Clara listened with a growing sense of hope, realizing it was an organized, step-by-step solution that didn't require more wood or a man's strength. It required only the understanding of how air behaved in an enclosed space. She realized that Henrietta Thorne was wrong. A woman alone could survive if she stopped fighting the frontier with brute force and started using the invisible laws of the world to her advantage. Marta told her she had her insulation already in the form of her grandmother's heavy wool quilts, and that she didn't need a husband. She just needed 5 centimeters of clast. Silence. Clara returned home with a determined fire in her eyes that her sons hadn't seen since their father had passed away. She went straight to the heavy cedar chest at the foot of her bed and pulled out the history of her family, her grandmother's double batting quilts. These were masterpieces of frontier craft, each one filled with thick layers of hand-carded wool and stitched with thousands of microscopic points. They were the most valuable things she owned, meant to be preserved for the future. But Clara realized that the future wouldn't exist if they didn't survive the present. She made the difficult decision to use these heirlooms as a living skin for the cabin walls, rather than letting them sit in a drawer while her children shivered. She began hand-carving the calculated pegs wooden dowels she made from seasoned ash, each one precisely notched to hold the quilts exactly 5 centimeters from the timber. She worked with a methodical focus, her hands moving through the ordered steps of preparation, ignoring the voices in her head that sounded like Henrietta Thorne. She measured each offset with a small wooden ruler, ensuring that the gap was uniform from the ceiling to the floor. If the fabric touched the logs, the bridge would be formed, and the cold would flow straight through. But if she could maintain that 5-centimeter void, she would have her stagnant air column. By the time the sun began to set, she had the first quilt hung a massive, indigo-dyed star pattern that now covered a significant portion of the freezing north wall. She stepped back and held her hand near the fabric, and the air felt different already. The whistling had softened to a low hum, and the convective waterfall that usually chilled her ankles felt like it had been diverted. She wasn't just building a fabric fort. She was building a future. She looked at her sons, who were watching her with wide, curious eyes, and told them that tonight the wind would stay outside where it belonged. The following 2 days were a blur of organized labor, as Clara transformed the interior of her cabin into a structured thermal machine. She didn't just hang the quilts. She engineered them into place using a step-by-step process to ensure the integrity of the air gap, realizing that even a small failure in the seal would compromise the entire stagnant column. She notched the wooden dowels into the cottonwood logs, creating a calculated offset that allowed the quilts to hang perfectly plumb. She was careful to overlap the edges of the quilts by several inches, pinning them together with thick bone needles, prevent any air leakage between the panels, creating a continuous inner skin that sat entirely separate from the house's structure. On the north wall, she created a thermal barrier that felt as solid as stone. But she didn't stop with the walls. She remembered Marta's lesson about the pressure drops that occurred every time the front door was opened. To solve this, she installed the Brana airlock entry, a heavy woolen curtain hung on a thick rope exactly 90 centimeters inside the front door. This created a small transition chamber where the cold air from the doorway could be trapped and warmed before it ever touched the main living space. She also tackled the floor-level drafts by creating wool gaskets from old felted blankets, which she wedged into the gaps along the baseboards. She was building a house within a house, a managed environment where the air was forced into a state of total stagnation. The cabin began to take on a strange, muffled quality, as if the fabric was soaking up the sound of the fabric world as well as the heat. Every morning, she would perform a structured check of the offsets, making sure the quilts hadn't sagged or touched the logs. She was treating her home like a Baltic trade ship, and the results were immediate. Even with the stove burning at half its usual intensity, the room felt balanced and still. She had cut her wood consumption by a third in just 48 hours, and for the first time in months, her sons were playing on the floor without their coats. It was a victory of engineering over tradition, but Clara knew that the settlement wouldn't see it that way. The expected welfare inspection arrived on a Tuesday, led by Henrietta Thorne and 2 other women from the auxiliary, accompanied by Silas Miller, the owner of the local lumber yard. Henrietta's face was set in a mask of stern duty, but as she stepped through the door and saw the quilts, her expression shifted to one of pure shock. She didn't notice the warmth of the room at first. She only saw what she called the disrespectful vanity of grandmother's heirlooms, hanging off the walls like common rags. Silas Miller stepped forward, his boots thumping on the floorboards as he inspected Clara's handiwork with a dismissive smirk. He called it dangerous engineering, claiming she was going to suffocate her logs and invite mold and rot into her home by spring. He argued that you couldn't fight the Nebraska cold with blankets and that she needed a man to cut enough wood for a real fire. He pulled at one of the quilts, trying to show how flimsy the calculated pegs were, but Clara stepped in his way and simply pointed to the bucket of water on the bench, It was no longer frozen. There wasn't a single crystal of ice to be seen, even though the fire in the hearth was barely more than a bed of glowing coals. Henrietta and Silas ignored the forefill water, choosing instead to focus on the shame of the display, and left with the same satisfied disapproval as before, convinced that Clara had finally proven her incompetence. They promised that the county would hear about this fabric fort, which they deemed no place for children. Clara watched them go, her resolve only hardening. She knew the science was on her side, even if the mirroring the furthers the placent. Experts were not. By the next afternoon, the story of Clara Vance's quilted cabin had become the primary topic of conversation at the general store and the blacksmith's forge. It was the best joke the settlement had seen in years, and men laughed about the one widow who thought she could stop a blizzard with a few inches of air and some old blankets. They called her the fabric architect and placed bets on which day she would finally come to Silas Miller's yard to buy the lumber for her rescue repairs. The mockery was structured and pervasive, a way for the community to reinforce the idea that their way was the only way. If you're enjoying this look at frontier justice and ingenuity, please subscribe to our endofview.com channel and let us know what you think in the comments. Clara went into town only once, and she could feel the eyes of the settlement on her back, but she didn't break. She had a secret that the town didn't know yet. Her methodical audit of her woodpile showed that she was burning only 10 logs a day when she used to burn 40, and her cabin was holding 60 degrees with ease. She had discovered that the stagnant air column acted like a thermal bank account, storing the energy from the morning fire and releasing it slowly throughout the night. She watched the mercury on her small wall thermometer and saw that the temperature didn't drop even when the wind picked up. The fabric fort was working perfectly, rendering the external weather irrelevant to her internal reality. She knew that the first true freeze was coming, the historic December storm that the old-timers were already predicting, and she was ready. She would let the town have their jokes for now, knowing that the Nebraska prairie was an unforgiving teacher and the exam was about to begin. She sat with her sons that night and felt a quiet, powerful sense of justice, knowing she had protected her family using nothing more than the invisible laws of the world and a few inches of silent air. In the middle of December 1883, the Nebraska Sandhills experienced what would later be recorded as the Great Die-Up, a historic, catastrophic storm that arrived like an explosion. The temperature plunged to 40 degrees below zero in a single afternoon, and the wind rose to 50 miles per hour, sustained. It was a killing cold that sought out the heart of every living thing, and Clara watched from her window as the world disappeared into a white maelstrom. The snow was fine as flour and as sharp as crushed glass, driven with enough force to penetrate a keyhole, and she could hear the sap in the cottonwood trees, outside freezing and expanding, the trunks popping like pistol shots. For the Prapel.com, other families in the settlement, the storm was an immediate crisis as their log walls began to shrink and groan under the thermal stress. Their chinking cracked, and the convective scour became a literal hurricane inside their living rooms. They were feeding their hearths at a desperate pace, but the wind was pulling the heat through the wood faster than the fire could produce it. Clara, however, was calm as she performed her structured check of the Clara wall, ensuring that the offsets were still holding. She could feel the enormous pressure of the storm pushing against the outside of the cabin, but inside, the air remained motionless. The stagnant column behind the quilts had become a dauntless, solid wall of thermal resistance, and the cold could not cross the 5-centimeter void of dead air. Clara added 2 small logs to the stove and sat down to continue her sewing, knowing that her fabric fort was the only thing standing between her family and the abyss. 3 miles away, the Thorne household was descending into a state of structured chaos as their large rooms and tall ceilings created massive convective loops that sucked the warm air away from the floor. Despite having a massive woodpile and working the fire around the clock, they couldn't get the main room above 40 degrees. Henrietta was huddled under 5 layers of wool, her breath visible as a thick fog, while the heavy Arctic air pushed smoke back down the Fortic chimney, filling the house with a choking haze. Her children were crying from the biting chill at floor level, where the internal wind was moving at a perceptible speed. Silas Miller was faring no better, leaking heat at a terrifying rate and burning through 3 weeks of wood in just 4 days. He realized that all his knowledge of lumber and joinery meant nothing if he couldn't control the air, and he was now shivering in a smoke-filled kitchen, his family in a state of growing medical crisis. They were fighting the storm with brute force, and the storm was winning. The organized traditions of the Plaid settlement were being stripped away by the raw physics of the winter. Henrietta looked at her frozen water bucket and felt a flicker of cold dread, wondering what was happening to the widow Vance in her fabric fort. She assumed Clara was already dead, or at least dying, and for the first time, the thought didn't bring her any satisfaction. Inside the Vance cabin, the atmosphere was almost surreal, as Clara achieved what seemed physically impossible. She had created a pocket of mid-September in the Procket, a heart of a 40-below blizzard. The stagnant air column had stabilized completely, creating a thermal buffer so effective that the interior of the quilts felt warm to the touch. Clara and her 2 sons were in their shirt sleeves, eating a hot stew of dried beef and root vegetables, while the stove consumed only 10 logs a day. The airlock entry at the door worked perfectly, and Clara had avoided the smoke problems that plagued her neighbors because her fire didn't need to be a roaring, desperate blaze. She felt a profound sense of peace as she watched her sons doing their schoolwork by the golden light of the lamp, knowing that the fabric fort was a silent machine that required no further effort once the physics had been established. She thought about Marta Sorensen and the shipwrights of Stockholm, realizing that they had given her the Ruppercent, the Frime, gift of independence through understanding. She had achieved justice for Elias by holding the land and her family together when the entire world was trying to tear them apart. The storm roared outside, but inside the Vance cabin, the air was still, silent, and safe. Clara looked at the indigo star quilt and smiled, knowing that the calculated pegs were holding fast and that she had emerged from her crucible unbroken. When the blizzard finally broke, the Nebraska sandhills emerged into a world scoured clean by the wind, and the silence was heavier than the snow. Across the Brockens Valley, the damage was catastrophic, with families exhausted and woodpiles devastated. But as the men began to dig their way out, a rumor began to circulate that Clara Vance's woodpile looked almost untouched. Suspicion moved quickly from mockery to a dark anger, as people accused her of stealing wood or burning her floorboards to stay warm. Henrietta Thorne, whose own home was a cold, smoke-filled mess, demanded a post-storm audit of the Vance claim to ensure the safety of the children, but really to expose whatever trickery she believed Clara was using. The town gathered, a humbled and tired mob needing someone to blame, and set out for the Vance claim with a sense of grim purpose. If you're finding this part of the story gripping, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more tales of hidden frontier wisdom. Henrietta and Silas Miller led the group, accompanied by Arthur Gable, a man of science who carried a calibrated mercury thermometer. They expected to find a shivering woman in a ruined home, but they were about to be very surprised. The group arrived at the Vance claim and was met by Clara, who stood her ground with calm eyes and a steady face. She challenged Silas Miller to a deal. If her house was colder than his, she would sign over the claim, but if she was warmer, he had to admit his modern cabins were thermal failures. They stepped into the 20 cabin and the transition to the stable warmth made Silas stumble. Clara explained the stagnant air column while Silas demanded a cool-down test, extinguishing the fire to see how long the house would hold its heat. They sat in silence for 2 hours, watching the mercury on Gable's thermometer. In any other cabin, the temperature would have crashed, but Clara's held steady. When the time was up, Gable announced that while a standard cabin would be at the freezing point, Clara's was holding at 58 degrees, having moved only 3 degrees since the fire was put out. The murmur from the crowd was like a thunderclap as they realized Clara had out-engineered the entire settlement. Silas Miller stood frozen, his arrogance stripped away, and Henrietta Thorne backed away as her social power collapsed. Clara's 3-2-degree verdict was final, and the jokes were over forever. The following Sunday, the atmosphere at the small sod church was fundamentally different as the community's silent judgment fell on Henrietta Thorne. Her social authority had been dissolved, replaced by the realization that her charity had almost cost a family their future. But the real moment of justice came when Silas Miller stood up and made a public confession, admitting he was wrong about Clara Vance and her engineering. He told the congregation that while he was burning his furniture to keep warm, Clara was living in comfort on 10 logs a day because she understood the land better than any of them. He announced that his lumber yard would now stock the materials needed to create thermal buffers, and that he would be asking Mrs. Vance for her advice. It was a total public reversal, and Clara was no longer the widow in a fabric fort, but the teacher of the plains. A few weeks later, as spring moisture reached the sandhills, Clara stood at Elias's grave and felt a profound sense of independence. She had proven her claim by surviving, and she told Elias that the house was sealed, and they were staying. She felt a wave of grief, pride, and justice, knowing she had protected his legacy by breaking the traditions he had taught her and listening to the silent laws of the world instead. Her sons ran out to meet her, their laughter elation 65, melody against the quiet of the prairie, and Clara knew she would never be cold. Again, her legacy spread beyond her claim, as builders across the territory began the methodical practice of furring out their cabins to create a permanent air gap, a step that became known as the Vance Void and cut fuel consumption by half. The Clara Wall didn't just save a woodpile, it saved a community's future. By the winter of 1885, the fabric fort was no longer a joke, but a blueprint for survival, with Silas Miller himself stocking specific materials to help neighbors create their own thermal buffers. The techniques once dismissed as foreign nonsense became the foundation of a new, resilient architecture that allowed the settlement to flourish even in the face of the most brutal Arctic cycles. Clara Vance lived on that claim for another 40 years, watching the Nebraska prairie transform from a killing field into a landscape of steady, protected homes. Her sons grew up to be engineers and builders, carrying the lessons of the stagnant column into the new century. The original cabin was eventually encased in a modern frame, but the 5-centimeter gap and the memory of the grandmother's quilts remained at its core, a silent testament to a widow's brilliance. True wisdom is rarely found in the loudest voice or the most expensive material. It is found in the woman with the hammer, who understands that sometimes the most powerful thing you can put between your family and the world is nothing more than a few inches of still, silent air. Clara's legacy remains a story of justice and inspiration, proving that the smartest solutions come from those who simply refuse to accept that freezing is just how it is. If this story of hidden wisdom and frontier grit resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel to join our community. Your support helps us bring more of these incredible, forgotten histories to light. And don't forget to tell us in the comments, what part of Clara's ingenuity surprised you the most? We love hearing your perspective. Stay warm, stay inspired, and we'll see you in the next story.